Welcome everyone to the Xojo webinar. I am Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist. And our topic this time is Windows installers. Now before we jump right into installers, let's talk a little bit about distributing your apps on Windows. Now starting with the most recent release of Xojo, that's 2016 R1 and R.1.1. Xojo Windows apps require the Windows Universal Runtime. You can read more about that on the doc page, but essentially we're using a more modern Visual C++ compiler to enable some essentially additional features for Windows in upcoming versions of Xojo. But this does require this new runtime to be present in order for your Xojo apps to run if they're made using 2016 R1 or later. Now most versions of Windows are going to have this runtime automatically there if Windows Update is already set up and running periodically or regularly. This will already have been grabbed from Microsoft and installed, and you won't really notice anything. But if you haven't noticed, or if you haven't had Windows Update turned on, or you haven't run it in a while, or some other reason or another, the Windows Universal Runtime might not be enabled, and you'll have to add it. We do include it with Xojo itself, both the installer and a bunch of DLLs you can package with your app if you'd rather do that. We'll talk about that a bit more, how you can integrate that into your installer, but you can read about all the details on that doc page. Now, obviously the easiest way to distribute an app is to simply zip it. Take your app, create a zip file, send it along your merry way. Now that might be okay for testing, but you really are not going to want to actually, when you released your software, package it up as a zip. Windows users are going to find that perhaps a little bit bewildering. It's not going to put your app in the location they expect. Certainly not going to show up in a start menu or even, with a nice icon on the desktop or anything like that. If you have less experienced users and then you ask them to unzip it and then open up a folder and then double click the exe, they might become confused when they open up that folder and see all kinds of things in there, not just an exe, and they might not know which one to actually click to run. So it's good for testing, but not a real practical way to distribute apps for final release. And on Windows, you really are going to want to use an installer. Now there's almost an infinite number of Windows installers that are available for you to use. I'm going to talk about a few today. And the first one, the one I'll spend the most time on, is Inno Setup. This is, probably my favorite, probably because I know it the best. But it's also pretty easy to use, quite flexible, and it's free. All nice features. We'll also take a quick look today at Advanced Installer. This one is maybe even easier to use, perhaps, because you don't have to actually write a script. It has a user interface that you can interact with. There is a free version of Advanced Installer, but it is a little limited for some things. And the paid versions start at, I think, like $400 and go up from there. So the free version probably is what is most practical, but it is pretty neat installer. And I'll mention a couple other ones that I am not going to actually go into and look at. One of them is the Nullsoft Scriptable Install System. NSYS is what you may see that abbreviated as on the internet. I've used this installer, a really long time ago. Someone recently mentioned it to me. I had actually forgotten all about it. I didn't know it was still around. But it is still around. It is an open source installer system, so it's free to use. And then I'll also just briefly mention Wix, which is a much more complicated Windows installer. Now, I already mentioned the Windows Universal Runtime is required for 2016 R1 and later. It is automatically installed by Windows Update if you have that set to run periodically and you're letting them run and do all the things it needs to do and restart your computer and that sort of stuff. There is what's called a redistributable installer that you can manually run, as I mentioned before, to install this universal runtime on your Windows configurations. We include this installer in the Xojo package after it's installed, so you can easily grab it and run it if you need to. And it also makes it easier to include in the installer that we'll build later because you already have the file available. For situations where it's not practical to run this separate redistributable installer to install the full Windows Universal Runtime on the computer, you can also package up the individual DLLs right alongside your app. Now, what's the difference? The benefit of using the redistributable is that everything is installed in the Windows system folders. So if Windows Update ends up in the future with security fixes for Windows Universal Runtime or updates or whatnot, it'll handle all that automatically because it'll be part of the system stuff. And your app will just take advantage of those updates. But if you use the separate DLLs and package them within your app, then those are the DLLs that will always be used with your app, and you won't be able to take advantage of any newer ones that Microsoft may push down as part of its Windows Update system. Both sets of these things, the redistributable and the folder of DLLs, are in the extras / Windows Runtime folder of your Xojo installation. And there are stuff there for both 32-bit and 64-bit apps that you can grab. And again, I refer you to the doc page that covers all that in a bit more detail. Now zip, I talked a bit about zip. One thing that surprised me a little bit on the forum is a few people didn't realize that zip is actually built into Windows these days. Has been for a while, at least through the user interface. All you have to do to zip something in Windows is right-click on the folder in the File Explorer and pick Send To, and then compressed zipped folder, and it will zip up that folder into a standard zip file that you can then pass along. So that's nice. It's built in. I suppose burying it under the Send To menu might be why some people don't realize it's pretty easy to access, but it is built in there. Personally, I prefer to use the 7-zip utility. This is a free utility, and it's pretty darn fast. You can just type 7-zip into Google. It'll take you to the website. This is probably the first utility I install whenever I set up a new version of Windows. I don't know why. I just like it. I'm used to it. It's fast. It can zip up things, make smaller files than the regular built-in Windows zip compression. But it's a neat little tool, so if you work a lot with zips, you may want to grab that. Perhaps not for file distribution, but maybe for other uses. And as I like to reiterate, zip for testing. I think that's an acceptable use of it, but I'd stay away from using it for actual app distribution. Now, Inno Setup. This is the tool we're going to spend most of the time looking at. And you can grab that from JR Software if you don't already have it. And one of its really cool things is that it's free. It is script-based, so you do need to create a script to actually build your installer, but we provide some sample scripts for you to get you started with your Xojo apps, and I'll be going through one here. We actually ship two, one for 32-bit and one for 64-bit apps with Xojo itself. And I'll be showing another one here for 32-bit apps that's a little bit more advanced than the one that's included with Xojo at the moment. And hopefully that will prove useful. Zip can create what are called setup.exe files. So like setup Xojo or setup your app.exe files. There are other type of installer files that are called MSI, and I'll talk about those when we get to advanced installer, but Inno Setup cannot create those. It can only create the setup.exe files. That's kind of what Inno Setup looks like. This is its simple editor. It's just a big text editor, and this has a script in it. There's also a little studio app, which is probably the thing I'll be using the most when we get to Inno Setup, which has a slightly better tabbed interface and a little bit of a navigator to jump around more quickly. And as I mentioned, some sample scripts are included with Xojo to help get you started with packaging your Xojo app as into an installer. And one cool little tidbit with Inno Setup that I've done with it in the past is it actually runs on OS X if you use the Wine system. I actually have something called Crossover Office, which embeds Wine. I forget what the acronym for Wine is. But essentially it's an emulation of the Windows APIs that run under Linux and Unix variants. And it allows some Windows apps to run under OS X or Linux. I guess it's primarily used for games, but some Windows apps can run, and Inno Setup is one of them. So this actually allows me to build a Windows installer on a Mac. And that's kind of neat, but I still need to take that installer over to a Windows computer or VM to actually run it and test it. But that's a neat little tidbit. All right, so now let's dive into Inno Setup and look at a script and how that can work with Xojo. All right, so here we are in Windows. And I have Xojo open, and we're looking at the Eddie's Electronics sample project. Pretty standard here. It's a standard example, nothing too exciting. But what we're going to want to do is build this and then package it up into an installer. Now, in order to package it into an installer, you're actually going to need a build. So you will build it. And you do that doing a normal build. So when you build it, it does its usual thing. And then if you go to the Finder, or the Explorer in the case of Windows, you can go to the folder where it is, look in the build folder, and you'll see you've got your main app, and then you've got the libs and the resources and the exe. So that's all the stuff you're going to want to include in your installer. So then you can go to Inno Setup. Now this is I mentioned this is the simple Inno Setup compiler, essentially, that lets you edit the script. But we're going to look at it using the Inno Script Studio app. It's also installed by Inno Setup automatically, but gives you a little bit fancier editing capabilities. And we're just going to go through this script real closely here. And I wanted to give a shout out to Lance Darby for sending me some of his information on some very advanced Inno Setup scripts that he's created for building Xojo apps. I stole a couple things from what he had after I reviewed them to kind of tweak the sample script that we were using with Xojo. So go up to the top of our script here. So you can see the first thing on this particular script is there's two essentially constants that are defined here at the top. One is the name of your app without the exe extension, and the other is the name of the project file. And essentially you can just set these, and that's it. The rest of the script uses these two constants to do pretty much everything else. So you can often just use this script as is, but we'll go through some of the things in here that you may want to know about. So the first thing is the app ID here. This is a GUID, which is just, numbers you've probably seen, but these are unique. And you really want them to be unique. So you can see the number I have included here. It starts with 27. You don't want to use that same number in all your app installers. That would confuse Windows. It would think that an app's already installed when maybe it isn't, or if you want to install something, it might install something else. So you always want that to be unique for each one of your apps and your installers. So you can generate a new one of these just by going to the Tools menu and picking Generate GUID. But you always want to make sure you always have a unique one. And every time you click that, you get a new unique one, so you don't have to worry about that otherwise. A bunch of things are set here, mostly by the constant. You probably want to change your publisher name to whatever your company name is. And you can put in URLs for other stuff. Generally, you're not going to want to often change too much of this. Output directory you may want to change if you have a specific location where you want to write the setup.exe after it's created. In this particular script, it will just save it alongside wherever the script file is. And the name of the setup file is just setup, the word setup followed by your app name. If you have a end user license agreement that's in a text file or something, you can just point to it here and it'll be displayed in the installer for the user to read and click accept. And the minimum version, you're probably going to want to have this. This tells the installer that it will only let it install your app on Windows Vista or later, which is the requirement for Xojo right now, since Windows XP is no longer supported. Windows version numbers are interesting, to say the least. So this actually here, 6.0.6001, means Windows Vista Service Pack 2, I believe. There is a list of what these values are in the Inno Setup docs, which is where I got that. So if it turned out you wanted your app to be, on Windows 8.1 or later, or Windows 10 or later, or something like that, you can grab whatever the numbers are. I'm pretty sure Windows 10 is not 10.0. It's more than likely something completely different than that. All right. Again, not much here you're really going to want to change. The directory section specifies that you want to create libs and resources folders when your app is built. And then this file section specifies all the files to include. And by default, it's going to include your exe file, all the files in the libs folder, and all the files that are in the resources folder of your built app that Xojo builds. Now, if you have other files that you need to include or other folders, you'll need to amend this part to add those things in. But as you can see, the structure here is pretty straightforward. The next section allows you to create a little desktop and start menu icons so that people can easily run your app. And remember, on Windows, people expect to see those sort of things. They don't want to run an installer and then not have an obvious way to run the app. And you certainly don't want to have to open up File Explorer and navigate to program files and find your app that way. This section gives the installer a little prompt at the end that lets the user click run the app after it's been installed. And then in these last two sections here, install the Windows Universal Runtime automatically for you. It gets embedded in your installer and it runs at the end so that you don't have to worry about it. It's just part of the package. People will get it. Everything's happy. So you can see here I've specified the path to it directly from 2016 R1.1. If you want to store it elsewhere, you can certainly do that, but it is included with Xojo, so you can just refer to it that way. And the run command down here actually runs the installer with some parameters to essentially tell it to run in the background and not require a restart. So, and you can change the status message that gets displayed. Now, in order to actually build the installer, when you have the script open here in Inno Setup, you can just hit the build button, which is right up here. And you can see it'll chug through and do its thing. And much like anything else, if you make a mistake in your script, you'll get error messages, compile error message, that sort of thing. And then when it's run, you'll get an installer right here that you can now double click and then walk through the usual prompts to install it. not going to actually run the installer yet because we want to build it again and run it. So that's kind of the manual steps. You've got your script, it's open in Inno Setup, and you build it from Inno Setup, and you now have your installer that you can then, put on your website for people to download, and then they'll have access to your app. Now we can make this even a little bit more automatic by having Xojo run Inno Setup to build your installer. And you can do that using an IDE script. So this is an example of what an IDE script might look like. And you can see here, the big thing that I'm doing is I'm running the Inno Setup command line compiler rather than the GUI compiler that we just were looking at. And the Inno Setup command line compiler is called ISCC, and it's in the Inno Setup. It's in the folder where Inno Setup is installed. So you can see I've put that path right here. And I've also created another variable that points to the location of my Inno Setup script. That's the same one that I had open in Inno Setup itself. And then I have specified another file that is just the name of a text file. And this is where the build output results will go. It'll just create a text file with essentially all that stuff you saw scrolling by in the UI window, in case there's some problem or you want to review it later. And then the IDE script just uses this shell command, or creates a shell command by combining these three components together, and then sends that shell command using the do shell command IDE script method to run it. And that's it. That will allow Xojo to build your installer. So you can run this script. It doesn't really have any UI to speak of. It just kind of runs. And then after it's run, you can see new installer here with a slightly newer date time. Now that's all cool. I didn't have to, open up Inno Setup and load my script and do all that manually there because I had it in a nice IDE script window. But the next thing you can actually do is put this as part of build automation so that this script runs when you build your Xojo app. And then you don't even have to think about it at all. You just, whenever you build, it'll run Inno Setup, create your installer for you as part of the build process. But when you're just debugging, you're using run, it won't. And to do that, in build automation down here, you can add a script. And here I added a script by going to build steps and picking script. And that created an editor here. And I just copied and pasted this IDE script that I created right in here. And right now I have this to none, but you can change the behavior, and that is when does the script run. And often when you create these sort of things, you want them to run for both. But in this case, essentially you just check release. And that means it'll only run this script when you do a build, and it won't run the script when you do a run. So you can see now if I pick run, it does its usual thing and runs it very quickly, and I can, get in there for testing. But then if I do my build, it will just take a little bit longer. And if I go back here, you can see we get a new installer file, slightly newer date. So that's kind of cool and nice feature of Inno Setup that you can kind of integrate it into your build process so that you don't have to manually do all this stuff each time. Alrighty. I think this script and the Inno Setup script and the IDE script I'll have included with the downloads for this webinar, and will also be included in the next version of Xojo. I've also been playing around with another script that, let's see if I can open that here, lets you even be more generic by passing in, you see right here we've got constants at the beginning, and you can actually leave those out. So you can see I got another script here. This one's not quite finalized yet, but I essentially just took those two constants out. And I have a different IDE script that passes in the constant values using another command line parameter for the Inno Setup command line compiler, where you can just essentially create constants on the command line and pass them into the script. And so I'm playing around with this to see if this might make it even easier to automatically run it from Xojo. But the sticking point I've run into at the moment is the fact that you really want different GUIDs. You have to have different GUIDs. And I haven't found a way to, I mean, you certainly don't want to change the GUID each time you build, because then newer versions wouldn't match up with older versions. So it still seems to require you to have separate Inno Setup files for each of your apps. And maybe that's okay, maybe not. But I'm still playing around with that, see if there's anything that we can do there to make that a little simpler. So that's what Inno Setup looks like. All right, let's see if I can switch back here and that work. Hey, it did work. All right, before we chug too far ahead here, I got a couple questions I want to just check. All right, going back to the Windows Universal Update, there's a question here from Edwin asking if is there a possibility that if Windows Update automatically updates the DLLs that are included in that, if that could have any impact on your applications. And I really don't see how that would be a concern. These things are kind of low-level system frameworks. And, I guess you would have the same level of concern as if there's actually it would be even less of a concern, but as if it was an OS update or something like that. But yeah, it's not like it's going to affect your code flow or anything like that. And Edwin also had a question regarding 7-zip and its ability to compress JPEGs and other things. Does it make them much smaller? And I haven't done tests on that, but in general, things that are already compressed don't typically recompress to be much, if any, smaller than they already were. And Lance, the man who knows more about Inno Setup than I ever will, is making a great suggestion about my GUID situation and saying maybe the GUID could be a constant in the Xojo app or in the Xojo IDE script, and that could be passed in to the Inno Setup script. I think that's a brilliant way around my situation, so I'll probably tweak that and test that out on my script. And if that works, I'll have that as an alternative as well. Because the idea is you want to essentially start with a single Inno Setup script that you can kind of just use as is, and maybe not even have to tweak for simple apps. And if we go with this suggestion from Lance and passing in the other parameters, we may just be there. So that's great. And Joost is noting that zipping is also easy using a tool called Total Commander, which is a replacement for Windows Explorer. I can't say I've heard of that, but I do use a replacement for Finder on OS X, and I'm sure a replacement for Windows Explorer on Windows would also be equally useful. All right, the next installer I want to talk about, not nearly as in-depth as Inno Setup, is Advanced Installer, which you can grab from here. And the free version is available with restrictions. If you go to advancedinstaller.com, it's a little confusing as to which one you want to download, because they have a button there that says get a version for free. And it looks like they'll give you a license to one of the full versions, maybe the pro version, for free in certain situations, like if you write a blog post review or you have an open source project or something like that. But you don't have to do that to use Advanced Installer for free. You can just download the regular one, and if you don't add a license code to it, it runs in, I guess they call it simple mode. And it'll let you create some simple types of installers, often many which will work for Xojo apps. So that's what we'll look at. And like I mentioned earlier, the paid version, from what I could tell, seems to start at about $400 and goes on up to way more than what Xojo itself costs. But as you can see, Advanced Installer has a graphical way to create your setup file. Quite a bit different than Inno Setup, and perhaps maybe easier to work with if that's something you're comfortable with. And the other thing is that Advanced Installer can create MSI installers. These are the Microsoft installer format. And these are a little bit different than the setup.exes. From what I understand, they are more powerful and they have some advantages for maybe more advanced enterprise type installations, because these, I think you can do network installs from these sort of things, and they allow network administrators a little bit better way to automate or automatically install things. So it's another type of installer format, and if that's one you require, then Inno Setup is not going to work for you. You'll have to find another tool that does. But it can also create setup.exe files as well. And Advanced Installer is pretty easy to use. I mean, obviously, anything with a UI that you can look at and kind of feel your way through is easier than just a blank slate where you got to write a script. But there it is. So let's take a look at that for Xojo. We'll go back to Windows. And here I have, not that one, this one. So here is Advanced Installer. And again, a installer for Eddie's Electronics. And you can see, I mean, you just kind of work your way through here and you fill in the information that you want. Product details, just type that in. The only big section here is the files and folders. Now, one limitation I found with Advanced Installer, unfortunately, is the free version, the freeware version that I'm using here, does not have a way, that I've found anyway, to launch the Windows Universal Installer redistributable automatically. So that's a bummer. So that means either, people would have to manually install that before they try to run your app. Or, and in the case of what I did here, you can include the DLL files manually that are in the folder. So you can see here, all kinds of DLL files have been added to the main folder right alongside the exe as part of this setup installation. And so that is one way around that with this freeware version of Advanced Installer. From what I was reading about this on their docs and on the internet, it appears you need the Pro version at a minimum to be able to fire off redistributables like the Universal Windows one. And all I did here is looking at where the files are. You can see right here, there, I just navigated to the installation folder for Xojo itself, and I selected all the DLLs that are packaged in there that you can use if you want, and I just dragged them into here. So it's pretty easy, and there they are. Now there's other things here. You can create registry keys if you needed to. I did cover some of this in a webinar a little while ago on working with file types. So on Windows, you have to create registry keys to manage that sort of stuff. And there's all kinds of other things you can set here. And it's nice that it kind of gives you, as you click on it, all this stuff's presented there so you can read it and check things as you need to. See here, you can check which versions of Windows you want your installer to work with. all that sort of stuff. And I didn't play around with this much, but it looks like you can even customize the installer. You can do this too with Inno Setup by adding your own dialogues, but that's kind of a much more advanced feature. But you can do that here by playing around with stuff in here. And then you can even add and make environmental variable changes and stuff like that. And to make the installer, once you've got everything filled in, you just have that all there, and then you click the little build button, and it chugs. And in this case, gives us an error, which I don't know why. Well, it says some images are missing that were there the first time I copied files over, so go figure. So let's remove the ones it's... can I multi-select? Can't appear to multi-select, so I'm going to just remove these and see if build works. I think what the problem was is when I did my first test on this, I was building a Retina version of this app, and then I turned it off. So since I didn't build the Retina version, it did not include the Retina graphics. And then that creates an installer out here in the setup folder. So we get an MSI that works very similar to the setup.exe mechanism. All right, so that is Advanced Installer. Now, at the beginning, I briefly mentioned Nullsoft Scriptable Install System. That is quite a mouthful. And I'm also only going to briefly mention it here, but it is an alternative that if you like investigating new things, or maybe you've heard of this or used this on something else in the past, you might want to also check it out. It's available on SourceForge, and it is open source. And it doesn't really come with any sort of editor that I really found. So you just edit your stuff in a text editor. And then it has this little make window where you can open your, essentially it's the compiler, and you open your script and you run it, and it gives you the output. And like I said, it's script-based, so you do have to write up the script, and it's got a full language and all that stuff. I have not played with this at all to see why I would use it over Inno Setup at this point. But like I said, if you have some experience or you like playing around with new things, it might be something you want to take a look at. And then I also came across this one here, Wix, at wixtoolset.org. This is huge. It is open source. It is XML and script based. And I believe it's now used as the basis for Visual Studio to create installers. But as is typical with big projects like this, it is very powerful, and it is also very, very complex. So I didn't dig into this at all either. Again, mostly because Inno Setup seems to be kind of the good middle ground between ease of use and flexibility. And I'm sure this Wix tool does way more than any of the other tools. But if you don't need that functionality, it might not be worth the time spent to learn how to use this one. But again, you just create your scripts, you fire off the compiler, and it does its thing and creates installers for you. So that in and of itself isn't different from a process standpoint. It's just, how much time you want to put into learning something else. So to recap, On Windows, use an installer. Easy recap. Include the Windows Universal Runtime, obviously, especially if you're building using 2016 R1 or later. And in most cases, you're probably going to want to stick with Inno Setup. That's it for my recap. So after all this, that's probably what for most people is going to work best. And now we've reached Q&A, so I am going to go over to my Q&A window here. I am attempting to record this differently than I have in the past. Actually, probably the same as I did the last Retina webinar. See if I can get better quality. But I do have a fake separate display going this time to display questions and whatnot. So we'll see how that all works. So far, it's been working okay. Looking here at a question. I got another question from Edwin. I'm not sure I understand this question. Something about App Store seem to have a website of publishers. Is there an alternative for someone who doesn't have a website or time to build one, like SourceForge or something like that, to publish an app? Is probably what Edwin is asking about. And I mean, your only alternative to publishing apps on your own, I mean, without a website, is to submit them to app stores, like the Mac App Store, of course. The Windows App Store is still very, very new. I don't think they are currently accepting Win32 apps in the Windows App Store. They're only accepting the, I forget the terms. They keep changing them around, but I think they might be called Universal Apps now. So Xojo apps cannot be sent off to the Windows App Store currently, although they are looking to change that, but I don't believe that's done yet. I think that might be something upcoming in the next beta of Windows 10. But really having your own website is probably going to be pretty important. I mean, even for, just marketing purposes, support, that sort of thing, you're probably going to want a website of some sort. Lance is also reminding me that Inno Setup can work with code signing tools such as Ksign if you do need to code sign your Windows installers, which is probably becoming more and more common these days. That is something I need to spend a little bit of time investigating. Might be a good topic for a future webinar on setting up certificates so you can code sign your installers, which essentially isn't much more than getting the certificate, building your installer, and then running the code sign tool so that it is all properly signed, so it shows your publisher name when you run it, rather than it saying unknown publisher. All right, and Edwin has clarified the website is just like information about the app and probably screenshots and stuff like that. Yeah, and I'm not too aware. I mean, on the Mac side, in the old days, there used to be sites like Version Tracker, Mac Update. I haven't really used those in a long time, so I don't know if they allow you to upload things, or if you still have to have your own website and download location. But like I said, having a website is probably the best way to go. I don't know if there's free things available in this day and age, but it seems like websites aren't too bad to get set up. All right, so like I said, the sample scripts, both the Inno Setup scripts and the IDE scripts that can run it, will be available on the download page for this webinar in the Xojo Dev Center and on the YouTube description. There'll be a link to them as well. So look for that in the next day or so. And other than that, I want to thank everyone for attending this time. Have a great day, everyone.